Make me.
Hey, Dan, leave it.
Oh.
The movie begins in Buffalo, where Dan, a top car salesman, has proven his skills by understanding his customers' motivations. Once again, he earns the title of Salesman of the Month, highlighting his success at work. Dan enjoys his simple life and is eagerly looking forward to celebrating his wedding anniversary with his wife, Jessica. They have 3 children: Kyle, Max, and Nah. The relationship between Kyle and Max is often tense, leading to frequent conflicts within the family. Dan also feels disconnected from Kyle, who spends all his time playing video games and rarely wants to go outside. Nah, their eldest daughter, is considering changing her college major due to the influence of her boyfriend, which worries Dan. Despite Dan's efforts to guide his children, they don't seem to listen. Kyle secretly plays video games at a friend's house, while Nah believes she's mature enough to make her own decisions. Dan and Jessica love attending annual festivals, but Jessica is starting to feel that their life needs more excitement and new experiences. After an exhilarating roller coaster ride, Dan promised to make their outing even more fun and surprising. In a sweet moment when Dan and Jessica shared a kiss, a stranger took their picture without permission and posted it online, which started to bother Dan. The situation worsened when the person spilled a drink on Dan and insulted Jessica. Despite being provoked and disrespected, Dan decided to walk away because he despises violence. Jessica didn't want Dan to get involved in a fight with those people, but she felt deeply disappointed in her husband. At home, Dan felt as if he had to suppress his anger, and the confrontation continued to haunt him. Jessica found solace in boxing, where an accidental punch to her sparring partner led to an unexpected friendship. She opened up to Gwen, her new friend and a travel agent, over their shared smoothie sessions. Jessica confided in Dan that she feels stuck in their current life. While she appreciates Dan's qualities as a husband and father, she's frustrated by his contentment with their status quo. While shopping with Max, Dan notices a suspicious man who seems to be following him. This man's behavior makes Dan uneasy, and he knows he has to be cautious. When the man makes him once home, Dan opens a secret compartment containing a gun, an outdated passport, and cash. This discovery unsettles him, prompting Dan to contact Augie, a former associate, to arrange new identities for his family. Augie warned Dan that they were in danger and suspected that the threat came from Dan's former boss, McCaffrey. Augie advised Dan to leave immediately. Dan revealed that he used to be an assassin, a secret he had kept from his family. McCaffrey might have discovered Dan's identity through the photo from the festival. Dan went to find Nah at an editorial meeting, only to discover that she had quit her job 3 months ago after being betrayed by a friend. Finally, he found Nah under the bleachers, upset about giving up on her dreams, but there wasn't time to deal with it because they needed to pick up her brother from the chess club. However, Dan was disappointed to find out that Nai's brother was actually at a neighbor's house playing video games. Dan informed the kids that they would be going to Vegas while Jessica was at work. He convinced Jessica to join them on a spontaneous trip she had been longing for, and though she was hesitant at first, she eventually became excited and decided to go. However, as they were about to leave the parking lot, they discovered that McCaffrey's men were already waiting there. As the bus passed by, Dan skillfully evaded the pursuit of the strangers. A while later they caught up with him, but Dan successfully kept his family from suspecting anything. Escaping the pursuit became more challenging as they were being tracked by satellite. Dan drove to his workplace and quickly closed the gate to hinder the pursuers. He then lifted the car and found the tracking device he had hidden. Luckily, the pursuers missed Dan in his car. Dan's family remained completely unaware of the situation. Dan decided to attach the tracking device to a colleague's car and asked him to drive on the highway. The pursuers fell for the trap, leaving Dan with less than 33 hours before his family's trip would be discovered. Meanwhile, Dan's wife and kids were tweeting and posting about their trip to keep it a secret. Dan confiscated everyone's phones to ensure no information was leaked. Even though the trip seemed unnecessary, the only issue was that the family didn't know exactly how to get there. At the travel agency, after some clever maneuvering, the sales agent provided Dan's family with a map to guide them on their trip. For the first time, the family felt truly connected during this journey. Meanwhile, McCaffrey personally visited Dan's house and confirmed that his family was still unaware of the threat. McCaffrey believed that one of them would slip up at some point. While talking with his sister, a stranger recognized Kyle from his streaming career and asked it to take a photo with him. Dan saw Kyle and the girl taking a selfie and immediately knew that McCaffrey would soon be on their trail. he decided to keep driving to avoid detection. McCaffrey had hired more people to track Dan, and Dan recognized 3 of them. While his family was asleep, Dan played music through all their headphones to cover up any sounds. He was prepared to use force if necessary. At that moment, his car mirror was shot, but Dan managed to escape the dangerous situation. Fortunately, he avoided a collision and only hit one of the pursuers. Dan's family was still sound asleep, and honestly, they were the soundest sleepers I'd ever seen. The third man, who had just flown off after a long night of driving, finally allowed Dan to close his eyes, though his family was still not awake. Half a mile from the college, who didn't want to attend, argued about being able to see the campus. Jessica, on the other hand, was excited and boasted about her keg stand skills, while Na admitted that the main reason she wanted to visit the campus was that her boyfriend, Trevor, was studying there. During the campus tour, Dan noticed a German man on the phone and suspected he might be one of McCaffrey's agents. However, Dan soon realized his mistake when he was suddenly attacked by another individual. A quick brawl broke out in a chemistry lab, and after a brief fight, Dan subdued the attacker and finally reunited with his family. Shortly after, the family prepared to continue their journey, but Na-e unexpectedly turned back to meet Trevor and discovered that he had been cheating on her. Heartbroken, she returned in tears. Dan comforted his daughter by teaching her a martial arts move, which made her feel stronger and more appreciative of her family. As they continued on their way, the family grew closer. While Na was driving, she thanked Dan for always being there for her and began to consider returning to her editorial position at school. At a small motel, the parents finally relieved some of their tension. Jessica felt a renewed sense of love for Dan and noticed that something was different about him. Meanwhile, Dan called Augie, who was on his way to deliver the new identities for the family. However, Dan still hadn't told them about this major change. Afterward, Dan secretly returned the phone he had taken and tried to prepare for the upcoming conversation with Kyle. When Kyle joined him, they finally talked about his streaming career. Kyle was really skilled at it, on a professional level, and wanted to prove his talent through a laser tag game with Dan. They bet on who could take down 3 people first. This was easy for Dan, given his past as an assassin. He quickly took down 2 targets, but Kyle countered with 2 accurate shots of his own. However, Dan was the one who ultimately won. Kyle felt a bit outplayed, but the two grew closer because of it. When they arrived in Las Vegas, they stayed in one of the city's top suites. But before they could enjoy it, Dan had to quickly run down the stairs to meet Augie, who handed him new identities, one-way plane tickets to Vancouver, and a large sum of money. Dan was mentally prepared to tell Jessica the truth during a romantic dinner, while Na watched over Max. He instructed the kids not to leave the suite under any circumstances. However, Kyle, with his reputation as a famous gamer, headed to the HyperX gaming arena, where he not only got recognized, but also had the chance to meet Valky. She even invited Kyle to join her team for the Valorant finals. But McCaffrey's men were also watching the event. While Na was casually chatting with a gamer who had given up his spot for Kyle, Kyle was leading the charge and dominating the opposing team. Dan tried to tell Jessica the truth, but he kept getting interrupted. In the end, he decided to postpone it and took her gambling instead, buying more time before revealing everything. A while later, Dan decided to check on the kids, but when he called, no one answered, causing him and Jessica to rush back. Upon returning, Jessica was deceived by the dolls arranged as if they were sleeping, which made her feel reassured that the kids were safe. She went to freshen up, played romantic music, and listened to old love songs. At that moment, McCaffrey's men suddenly attacked. Dan reacted quickly, throwing vodka and shooting at it, creating a blaze that took down the attackers. However, Jessica was taken hostage. Dan lowered his gun but secretly grabbed a knife. When one of the attackers called Dan Sean, Jessica was shocked to realize the truth. Taking advantage of the distraction, Dan neutralized that attacker. Jessica ran to find the kids but only found the dolls, immediately realizing they needed to go to HyperX, where Kyle had mentioned. Honestly, Kyle's team should have played a bit better, as he was still pretty poor despite ending the game with 30 kills. As soon as the match ended, Dan and Jessica went to pick up the kids. Dan finally admitted that he had been a secret assassin and that his former colleagues were now hunting him. At first, the kids didn't believe it until they were attacked and forced to hide behind a car. Dan quickly neutralized the attacker, but her armor kept her alive, forcing them to act more aggressively. Dan continued to confess about his past as a mercenary for McCaffrey and that he had killed 42 people. Kyle, feeling that Dan was a hypocrite, began to understand why his father had always opposed leaving the city and using social media. Dan gave his family new identities. Jessica became Molly, and Kyle became Van, like the name of a van, after 18 years of hiding the truth. However, the family refused to accept Dan. Jessica decided to leave him, declaring that she would take care of the children. She called Gwen for help, while Dan was left outside guarding until morning. Despite Dan's attempts to explain that it wasn't safe, and that McCaffrey would continue to pursue them, Jessica only asked him to keep his distance and stay away from the family. When Jessica met Gwen, it turned out that Gwen was a powerful woman. Unexpectedly, Gwen began to talk about her former lover, who had built an entirely new life with a woman Gwen could not tolerate. Instead of being jealous, Gwen befriended the woman and quietly waited for her to fall into the trap that had been set. Later, Jessica unexpectedly outsmarted McCaffrey, but the situation didn't end there. McCaffrey called Dan, in him that his family was being held captive by him. McCaffrey arranged a meeting at an abandoned hotel, where his henchmen were scattered around. Dan arrived at the penthouse, where McCaffrey greeted him with a mocking hug. The horrifying truth was revealed: McCaffrey was Dan's biological father. He wanted Dan dead for being abandoned, but over the past days, Dan had taken down all of McCaffrey's henchmen. Dan's father wanted him to return to serve him and promised to release his family if he agreed. If Dan refused, his family would die. With no other choice, Dan had to accept. Suddenly, the children's sense of morality emerged, and they, along with Jessica, were determined to protect Dan from this cruel fate. Though just a moment before, the kids had wanted to cut ties with Dan. As Kyle pressed the elevator button, they began to change their minds. While the kids tried to convince Jessica that they couldn't abandon Dan, Jessica started changing Max's diaper, then suddenly shoved the diaper in the face of one of the henchmen, threw him to the ground, and took him down. They decided they would take Dan back. Meanwhile, McCaffrey was taking care of some matters, and Gwen, using her charm, attempted to lure Dan back to her, ignoring the technician. She knew about the tactics Dan had used, but Dan's family arrived just in time to rescue him. When Dan knocked Gwen out and rendered her unconscious, the technician was captured as a prisoner. Dan apologized to Jessica for keeping secrets and promised to always tell her the truth from now on. He wanted to be a loving husband and father, fully committed to his family. Meanwhile, McCaffrey began to suspect something when he noticed the technician's strange behavior. Kyle tested a drone and discovered that Dan was actually skilled with technology. As the henchmen closed in, Dan ordered his family to run to the rooftop while he stayed behind to handle the situation. Kyle, with the drone in hand, became Dan's eyes and ears, tracking and reporting the positions of the henchmen. Despite being outnumbered, Dan skillfully took down each one. McCaffrey discovered that the drone was aiding Dan and woke Gwen to track down his family. Dan tried to convince his father to stop, but he refused to listen. 10 henchmen continuously fired automatic rifles, but Dan deftly dodged every shot. Noticing the elevator was moving up, Jessica quickly hid the kids and prepared to shoot when the doors opened. However, Gwen emerged with a calm demeanor. Gwen taunted Jessica, believing she had the upper hand in the one-on-one fight, and did not see Jessica as a worthy opponent. Despite this, Jessica remained resolute, while Kyle informed Dan that 9 more henchmen were approaching. Dan systematically took down each henchman, leading people to question why McCaffrey hired such poor shots. Nevertheless, McCaffrey took satisfaction in finally shooting down the drone. Meanwhile, the fight between Gwen and Jessica intensified, with Gwen gaining the upper hand and burying Jessica under a pile of debris. McCaffrey knocked Dan down and had the chance to shoot him, but became distracted by boasting about how the family had made Dan weak. Gwen cornered the kids, giving Jessica the strength to escape from the rubble. However, Jessica was still tossed around by Gwen like a toy. As Dan tried to remove the bullets from McCaffrey's gun, they were forced into a tense hand-to-hand struggle. Jessica, with her last ounce of strength, grabbed a bamboo stick and made a powerful leap, but ended in a devastating failure. Gwen found it amusing when Jessica tried to fight again, but this time Jessica succumbed to Gwen. McCaffrey was about to finish Dan off with a gun, but at that moment, the family appeared and expressed their deep concern for Dan. This gave Dan the chance to act. The family was reunited, and the police arrived shortly after. 6 months later, Na had become a renowned journalist, while Dan had started a self-defense company and hired Augie as a partner. Jessica became a trainer, and Kyle continued to make online videos. The family was preparing for a big trip, packing the RV to take Na to Stanford. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and see you in the next video.